I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Leo Zagami. Be sure and check out my films out there in the streaming universe. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. I Call It Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku, Apple, and a few more. We are booking guests for January. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Today I want to welcome back to the show Leo Zagami. He walked out from what he perceived as the criminal side of the New World Order, or Illuminati, and now exposes the dark side of these shadowy factions. He is an author of several books. Leo, welcome back. How you doing?
Always a pleasure to be with your show, and I heard you've been doing a lot of things since the last time we spoke, so I'm glad you are creating some great documentaries along the way with your shows.
Yes, thank you so much, and it is wonderful to have you back. It has been a while. Really looking forward to getting into your new book, The Rise and Fall of a Frankist Monster, exposing Jeffrey Epstein and the most powerful Jewish sect in the world. This is such a huge topic right now. But as far as the information we have access to about the status and progress and real history of this man, we don't get much. There seems to be a lot of gaslighting, demoralization, misinformation. So I'm really looking forward to getting deeper insights into not only what's been unfolding behind the scenes, but who this man really was. Before we get into this, though, remind the audience just a little about yourself and let them know how they can find more about you.
They can find more about me on leozagami.com. I'm an author, investigative journalist with a past also within the realm of secret societies that we can commonly refer to as the Illuminati and Freemasonry. So you can find, like I said, more about that in my bio on my website.
Wonderful. Tell us a little bit about what brought you to write this book and what you mainly focused on.
Well, I thought that there was really a missing link nobody was talking about. I mean, there has been thousands of articles written about Jeffrey Epstein, about his milieu of people. There has been, of course, documentaries, and some of them, might bring also to light some interesting subjects. But I wanted to really point on something that nobody has discussed, the ancestral roots of Jeffrey Epstein and his milieu, the background from a political, of course, point of view is typical of the power players of this age. But when it comes to the anthropological, religious, sectarian, that, like I said, has been not well discussed at all. And so I published this book, and I'm glad that the readers are finding it interesting, because it came to become number one in history of Judaism, also in other categories like espionage, biographies, and so on. And like I said, I think the main thing that the readers find interesting is to analyze what happened in the light of a past which has been hidden for most of this time. We have heard some sporadic references to the Sabbatean Frankist as a sect within Judaism, but very few historians have really published any material of relevance about it. I think Gershon Scholem, as an historian and also a well-known figure in the history of Kabbalah, has been one of the few people. Now, today we have maybe the occasional academic who likes to dwell into this subject, but it's very rare that you find publications, because it's in the interest of certain rabbinical schools and certain branches of Judaism to really keep the truth about the Sabbatean Frankist from coming to light.
Excellent. And like you were saying, you go very deep into even the Jewish folklore, the history and roots of Jewish secularism. You even go back to the story of the golem. Tell us a little bit about the origins of these groups, like you mentioned, the Sabbatean Frankists, and what you focused on about the history.
Yeah, I mean, for those who don't know who the Sabbatean Frankists are, in a nutshell, Shabbatai Zevi was this Jewish figure who gathered a lot of attention in the 17th century, declaring himself the Messiah and really receiving support for a time by more than half of the Jewish population living in Europe. It became sectarian when he eventually was forced to convert to Islam, and so did his most close disciples and followers, at that point creating what has been known in the history of the Ottoman Empire as the Domme, this crypto-Jewish sect, which continued to practice their Sabbatean rituals in secret, while instead portraying themselves as Muslim outwards. This crypto-Jewish modality was already known in the Jewish world since the time of the Spanish Inquisition in the Iberic Peninsula, when they purged the Iberic Peninsula of both the Jewish as well as the Moorish presence, and they forced everybody to convert to the Catholic faith. And so at that time, we have the birth of what are known as the conversos or the marranos. So the conversos are the more genuine converts to Christianity. The marranos, instead, the pigs, the ones that were actually continuing in secret to practice Judaism. And it was actually within the marranos, which I describe in my book, has a link, which is unthought of, with the Puritans in England, with Oliver Cromwell and the people around him. Oliver Cromwell, for those who don't know it, was the guy who, for a brief time, created a republic in what is now the United Kingdom once again. It didn't last that long, to tell you the truth, but it was important historically, the Oliver Cromwell episode, because thanks to the people close to him who were very much entrenched in this Jewish mysticism and messianic legacy that came from it, that gave the very roots of what today we, of course, acknowledge as Zionism. But from that moment onwards, there is also a close link with Shabbatai Zevi, because Mordecai Zevi, the father, was working for these British Puritans in Izmir, Turkey, and so he brought inside his household the ideas that were propagated by a guy called Menasseh ben Israel, the ambassador of the Jews, who eventually got Oliver Cromwell to get the Jews who had been kicked out of England for several hundred years from the whole British Isles back to the British Isles. So that was an important development, but that was only the first stage, because the plan was always to bring them back there and then back to Israel. It of course took several hundred years to break down the Ottoman Empire. But we must say that, like I described in my book, the Ottoman Empire faced extinction, especially at the hand of the Domme and the Masonic lodges connected to them from that place called Thessaloniki, which nowadays is part of Greece, but at the time was part of the Ottoman Empire and was one of the most important ports in Jewish communities. Now, Shabbatai Zevi, of course, died and then left his legacy to another guy who claimed to be his reincarnation. That was Barak Russo. Barak Russo didn't live a long life. In fact, is very rarely mentioned. and we talk always about Sabbatian Frankism rather than Sabbatian Russo-Frankism, because he was still retaining most of the beliefs of Sabbatai Zevi without adding anything new. Jacob Frank himself was actually born in what today we call Ukraine, and close to Poland, and he was from a Sabbatian family who was forced to abandon those areas after his uncle has aroused attention with spreading some Sabbatian publications that were deemed dangerous by the rabbinical communities that then will work in tandem with the Inquisition, and of course the Catholic Inquisition was still, let's say, alive and kicking, even if not as strong as it was. But then we have also other forms of inquisitions in the Protestant churches, and the rabbinical courts worked often connected with them. There was a book in particular, a book that not many people know about, because this is the first time really that you can find in a book of almost 300 pages not only summarize the history of Sabbatian Frankism, but also of their beliefs. Like, for example, the Vavo Hayom Elahin, that was this book attributed to a guy, a rabbi, who then became involved in a controversy, a rabbi that was also then linked to Jacob Frank family-wise, and to Moses Dobruska, who became also another important figure in the creation of the Asiatic Brethren, and also a member of the Order of the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt. So the spreading of the teachings of Shabbatai Zevi and then Jacob Frank became also known outside of the Jewish world thanks to these Masonic lodges and Illuminati lodges. But before that, Jacob Frank distanced himself from the traditional Islamic context of the Ottoman Empire and brought back instead a different form of Sabbatianism that at that point became Frankism. So Sabbatian Frankism, the merger of this idea of also including elements of the Catholic faith, the Trinity. Initially, it was a guy called Nemeya Hayun, who was a Bosnian Kabbalist linked to Sabbatianism, who lived in Sarajevo, who back then, by the way, was part of the Ottoman Empire, because these things need to be understood. The borders were very different from today's borders, and the Ottoman Empire was extremely influential. So he had received a traditional Talmudic education, but then he went on to become a very important figure. He went to Palestine, he went to Egypt, and then he appeared in Smyrna, which is today called Izmir. Izmir is a very important location because, of course, Shabbatai Zevi started preaching there. And when this guy arrived there, who was very much entrenched with the knowledge, and he was securing himself his rabbinical position, he then wanted to mix elements of the Trinity, of the Trinitarian God, into the Sabbatian beliefs. So Memut de Kula became a publication that was basically well known before Jacob Frank started to reveal himself, but gave those bases, let's say, those bases of merging Christianity and in the Trinity in particular with this form of heretical Judaism. A form of heretical Judaism, though, that was very much condemned as heretic by most of the Jewish contemporaries because it promoted the swapping of wives, orgies, and all the basis of that misled Kabbalistic interpretation that led to people like later on Aleister Crowley and, of course, influenced even Madame Blavatsky. I'm very down to the point here in this book, if you know what I'm talking about, when I, for example, dedicate a whole chapter to Max Theon, which is considered the mentor of Madame Blavatsky, but very few people maybe know about him. Or, for example, Ignatius Treblish Lincoln, a figure that comes from the Sabbatean Frankist milieu of Hungary, and then becomes this sort of, I define him as an international man of mystery, because he changed so many roads in his life. And this is typical of, though, the Sabbatean Frankists, the versatility, the fact that they have often been involved in intelligence operations, but also the fact that we find them at the very creation of some of the most important ideologies that have transformed Europe. Now, when it comes down to Moses Dobruska, who was the son of the cousin of Jacob Frank, he was also the grandson of this guy, Rabbi Hebe Schutz, who wrote the Vavo Hayom Elahin, that was considered like a holy book by the Sabbateans. He has a really important role because he changes name, of course, many times in the various roles that he has. He's another international man of mystery, like Ignatius Treblish Lincoln, who started as a Jew and ended up as a Buddhist monk going through the rise of Nazism, and even a member of the SRA and involved with the Anglican Church. So here we have people that, I repeat, they're very versatile in transforming themselves. But that's really the very basis of Jacob Frank's new, let's say, move. He didn't want to be stuck in the Islamic world of the Ottoman Empire. He wanted to bring his new form of Sabbateanism in the Catholic world by bringing also to the Jesuits 20,000 Jews that will convert, and that he will initially call the Edomites, the Edom followers. And Jacob Frank wanted to open up to the Christian world the Sabbatean heresy, something that then became, of course, immediately controversial. And in fact, he was then arrested by the Inquisition.
Right. Now, you mentioned a few things that I'd like to dissect a little bit. First being their true beliefs. You mentioned how they mismatch different theological belief systems, but what it is at its heart is truly something that seems very dark, resembling what we would now understand as Luciferianism, right?
Yeah, well, it's inverting the basic tenets of Judaism, going and eating pork in the holy days, or literally interpreting also Lurianic Kabbalah, which itself was becoming a new thing within Judaism. People were starting really to follow the Sefer Yetzirah and the teachings of Lurianic Kabbalah, but then they were, of course, they were following the whole thing in a traditional way, because Isaac Luria, who was born in 1534, died in 1572, this Jewish rabbi who developed was no Shabbatai Zevi or no Jacob Frank or no Baruch Russo. He wasn't an heretic. He was simply a guy who stick to the tenets of the Mosaic laws, the 615 laws, and the respect, of course, for those Sinaitic laws that were delivered to Moses. One instead, of course, that can't be said for these people. These people were, the Lurianic Kabbalah, the doctrines of creation are to be respected within a context which is not, of course, Christian, but has a traditional, let's say, it describes the origins of evil. It describes the exile of what we see as the Shekinah, the divine presence, the doctrine of the redemption, while instead, and of course, still sees sexuality as something very holy that shouldn't be messed with. While instead, in the context of the Sabbatean Frankist, with Shabbatai Zevi, we immediately see all these things reverse. He goes into the elements of Lurianic Kabbalah to define what is known as redemption through sin. So the holy book, Vavo Hayom Elahin, becomes the description of this imaginary Shabbatai Zevi going on top of a mountain to then, of course, free himself of every, constraint and in this antinomian way. So basically without respecting any rules of the Jewish religion and creating new ones as it went along. It's very important that we understand that the rabbinical courts of Frankfurt, of Mannheim in particular, investigated this matter, found that there were people who were really dangerous for the faith, including the uncle of Jacob Frank. So from the very beginning, the Sabbateans were already under under investigation. Then Jacob Frank arrives and he adds even more controversy, because here we have a guy who radically reinterprets the Shekinah as being the Holy Mary of sorts. During his time, he was arrested ultimately also by the Catholic Inquisition, because he was dealing secretly with the Orthodox Russians, and he will be eventually freed by them. He was staying in one of the most important monasteries that there is in Eastern Europe, the Holy Mary of Czestochowa, the Black Mary, which was very revered by John Paul II. So I also give to the Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell story a completely new twist, because I explain why they were received in private audience by a Polish Pope who was very well versed with the Sabbatean Frankists. Because if today we have the possibility of studying many elements of it, is because of the archives that come from Poland, one of the few places where they survived these documents, because they were very secretive. Yeah. They were very secretive when they moved to America. They were very secretive when they moved around the world, because their interest was never really to become visible. They wanted to create the banking cartel in Mannheim, the basis of it in Frankfurt, and Jacob Frank, when he was liberated, he eventually created this court in Offenbach, just near Frankfurt, where the lodges, of course, already of the Illuminati were trying to become active in his very name.
The method that they use to infiltrate all of our institutions, and from what it seems, they've infiltrated many of our religious and financial and political institutions, basically everything that controls our systems. But the method they do it is extremely parasitic, because they take on the traits of this other religion or belief system, integrated into something that vaguely resembles Christianity or whatever they're trying to hide behind, and it becomes something new. And over time, it's not recognizable as to what it was.
Well, for example, when Jacob Frank eventually, being investigated, gave the permission to his followers to marry into the Catholic world, he didn't simply go and marry into the butcher on the corner. He got them to marry with the elite of the Catholic world. And on top of that, he also gave orders. So when you will be baptized in the Catholic faith, you will take on the surname of your godfather, which will become another very covert way of infiltrating some of the best families, because their godfathers will not be the modest guy who we find in a typical town in Poland or Ukraine or Moldova or whatever. It will always be connected to the aristocracy. That was how they eventually arrived to the heart of the Austro-Hungaric Empire, Vienna, with the Rothschild, who were first nobilitated there. Rothschild also part of this Sabbatean Frankist establishment. You said it very well. I mean, they tried to infiltrate, but let's not forget who inspired them, because they were very close to the Jesuits. And the Jesuits are really inspirational on that front. But when we go and see, for example, I published a book that is the last one of the Confession series, volume 12. I explain also the importance that the Conversos and the Marranos had in the very formation of Ignacio Loyola. The Alumbrados, who were the Illuminati of the time, who were mixing Jewish mysticism, Islamic influences, and they were already, if you think about it, putting together that syncretism that became then of the Sabbatean Frankist.
Yeah. I want to get into Epstein a bit, talk about his rise to power, who he really was, where the hell he came from, and why him.
Well, of course, it always comes from the family background. So the first thing which I did in my book was to go and look into the family background of Jeffrey Epstein, of Ghislaine Maxwell, and suddenly I find myself with an ancestry which was clearly influenced by the Sabbatean Frankist. I mean, when Jacob Frank didn't manage to force him to convert into the Catholic faith some of his acolytes, he then told them to infiltrate what was then became the Hasidic community, the Orthodox community, so they could infiltrate and hide themselves from the other. You see, still to this day, the problem that Judaism has in confronting the Sabbatean Frankist heresy is that many of the most illustrious rabbis, including, for example, Rabbi Eberschutz, are considered to this day some, geniuses of the and sacred figures of Judaism that are untouchable. So that is, I think, Jeffrey Epstein comes into that situation. His family is from Brooklyn. It's a family that, of course, comes from Eastern Europe, from the Sabbatean Frankist, let's say, strongholds of Eastern Europe and Russia. And the Stavovsky, the family of the mother, as well as the family of the father. And then we have, of course, the family of Ghislaine Maxwell, the Hawk family, which then becomes the Maxwell family. Now, these things are rarely, if not at all, discussed by any journalist or historian, to my knowledge. I was kind of like fascinated by putting together this book because of the lack of information that I found when I go around, because everybody's focusing, Jeffrey Epstein was working for the Mossad or the Shin Bet or was working for the... Yeah, it's not that, it doesn't work that way. It's the Mossad, the Shin Bet, and the Israeli state that works for the Sabbatean Frankists, who have created the state for their own purposes. So they turn it around, and in a way, when they turn it around, they make it impossible for the common folk to really understand who is behind this whole thing. So Jeffrey Epstein, in the middle of the 70s, finds his patron of sorts in Donald Barr. Donald Barr, the father, of course, of the future head of the DOJ, when he himself is suicided. Now, a lot of people who still believe that Trump can be genuine in this situation say, but Trump was, at the time the president when Jeffrey Epstein was arrested. No, Donald Trump was the president when Jeffrey Epstein was suicided, which is another thing. It means that you are basically trying to eliminate any traces and connections to a figure that, of course, was very powerful. Now, you see, they can't really understand the rise of Jeffrey Epstein, but it's very easy to understand the rise of Jeffrey Epstein once you understand how the Sabbatean Frankists work. First of all, they support their own. Even within the Jewish community, they are a restricted and internal community to the Jewish community. They hate other Jews. So in reality, they might seem in favor of Israel or in favor of Judaism, but they hate anybody that hasn't fought for their fake messiahs, because they are fake messiahs. They are false prophets, as we call them in the New Testament. So to deliver the truth about Jeffrey Epstein means to go, first of all, behind the scenes. And the first figure of controversy who we find is Donald Barr, because Donald Barr is this guy who was born in 1921, dies in 2004, but the guy is an incredible figure. He has a time in the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, during World War II. He is a Jewish person who converts to Catholicism at a later age, which only the Sabbatian Frankists do, to then rise up in the Catholic faith, his sons, and that's why really there is a problem, when people talk William Barr, Donald Barr, they don't connect them to the Jewish world. And his Jewish family hails its roots from the city of Berdikiv, which is a major center of Hasidic Judaism that was infiltrated by the Sabbatian Frankists. So Donald Barr is typical Sabbatian Frankist. I mean, he's a Jew and then he converts to Catholicism. He brings up as a Catholic his even William Barr, that, as we know, was strategic as U.S. Attorney General during the first Trump administration. He had written a book, Space Relation, just a year before employing Jeffrey Epstein in a school, a very preppy New York school in New York, without Jeffrey Epstein really having even I mean, he should have had a PhD, some kind of degree to be to teach science and mathematics in a school like that, without really having any, he went to high school, but he never really got further than that. How is it possible that this guy gives him a job at the Dalton School with all these elite people there? It's obvious that that Donald Barr found in Jeffrey Epstein not only a good Sabbatian Frankist that could, indulge into what they believe, which is a redemption through sin, is creating sin around them of immense proportions. So then once you create all this sin, you are kind of like unattached by it. You are, going above it. But also because both Sabbatai Zev and Jacob Frank believe that by doing all this, they will get closer and closer to the messianic times that they will eventually bring back the future king of Israel. So aside from everything else, of course, we see that Shabbatai Zevi, who, for example, gets to be the Messiah only when Nathan of Gaza, in Gaza, by the way, a place that is still very controversial, accepts him and says to him, you need to reveal yourself as the Messiah. At that point, the Synhedrin in Jerusalem rejected him. It was Gaza the place where the Sabbatians first evolved, and where all the tribes of Israel, the remaining tribes, that we have also the thing that there is 2 tribes that are the ones that are known, and we have 10 tribes that are unknown of Israel. Now, in the context of the Sabbatians, Mordechai Zevi, the father of Shabbatai Zevi, was very much also connected to this guy called Menasseh Ben Israel, who, by the way, connected with another guy from Oliver Cromwell's background, who gave birth to this belief, British Israelism, which became a very important belief to then convince the British people that they were the lost tribes of Israel, that they had to support the Jews in a special way, and eventually support the Balfour Declarations after the Sykes-Pike Agreement. So the Donald Barr, who gives Jeffrey Epstein this first job, publishes a book that is filled with not so well Sabbatian Frankist reference, in which we have basically this pedophile from outer space, and we have a figure that resembles Ghislaine Maxwell called Lady Morgan, indulging in acts of sadism. And I mean, it's incredible that, these people were actually already preparing the rise of Jeffrey Epstein. And that happened eventually. It was sanctioned in the middle of the 80s when Les Wexner, another member of this clique of people, gave him that building that eventually he will sell to him for $1 worth millions, which is that rigged with cameras and everything to start the operations. The operations that, of course, then he carried on also at the Zorro Ranch, he carried in Little St. James, and the operations that I expose in my book connected also to the science of transhumanism, robotics, hands-on robotics, the software behind Sophia the robot. I mean, when I mix the face of Jeffrey Epstein and Frankist, there is a reason, and there is actually many layers. There is the layer of the interpretation of the word Frankenstein, because Mary Shelley was inspired by Jacob Frank. And Franken was for Frank. And that Stein means stone, but also the Ein is like the eye in the interpretation, also in the Kabbalistic interpretation, but is the Frankenstein monster that gets out of control, like the Order of the Illuminati that is created within the world of Freemasonry, that then rises and creates itself problems getting out of control. Let's not forget that in Mary Shelley's history, Dr. Frankenstein goes to the University of Ingolstadt. So there is also that clear reference to the Illuminati. The husband of Mary Shelley is himself involved in these secret societies we commonly refer to the Illuminati. So the link with Frankenstein it's very direct. It's not just a imaginary. And like you said, the golem. The golem is a folk tale of something, of a monster created out of clay with a formula, Kabbalistic, magical formula by these rabbis who then create something which goes out of their control. They can't control any longer. It's supposed to protect their community, but then becomes something. And Jeffrey Epstein was, of course, working for the intelligence of Israel to protect their communities also around the world and stuff. But at the same time, Jeffrey Epstein gets out of control. And Jeffrey Epstein, in the end, becomes the victim of his monstrosities. So in 1991, they created this Jewish study group known as the Mega Group with Les Wexner, Charles Baughman. In it, we find, in fact, a guy which is very important, Ronald Lauder. Lauder, one of the first financiers of Benjamin Netanyahu, from one of the heirs of the Estee Lauder Cosmetics company, was the ambassador in Austria in the 80s, when eventually Jeffrey Epstein is also given a passport, Saudi Arabia passport, with residence in Austria. Austria, the home of the Sabbatean Frankists, because it's true that they develop in Eastern Europe, but it's also very much true that their lodges became more and more influential in in Vienna, because Vienna was considered like, the New York of the time, let's say.
Yeah, that is fascinating. You mentioned briefly some of the operations that Epstein was involved with, and the ones most people know about: blackmail operations, trafficking, but you also mentioned transhumanism. This goes deeper into layers most people aren't aware of. Talk a little bit about the transhuman aspect.
First of all, people need to understand, Jeffrey Epstein had an office in Harvard University. It's not like me and you can go and open an office in Harvard University. No? So that gives you the idea, with the academic world hand in hand, professors that were deemed to be very inspirational, very powerful at the time, will simply bow down to his influence and go and visit him in Little St. James, and of course indulge also with whatever depravities they were indulging. Also in the Zorro Ranch. Both the Zorro Ranch as well as Little St. James, aside from Little St. James having that, of course, clearly that temple, which is, by the way, inspired by a building that was a hotspot of Sabbateanism in Aleppo in Syria, which is something that needs to be. But the fact that this guy was connected to Peter Thiel, he was connected to Elon Musk, he was connected to a lot of people that are at the basis of what we are living now, this dark enlightenment era.
100%.
So it's very important for people to understand. For example, Jeffrey Epstein invested a lot of money in the study and research of things that the common folk will find weird. Right? He wanted to inseminate the world with the semen of Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, what is that all about? I mean, the Epstein empire intersected with the Santa Fe Institute, where he donated $275,000, where Jim Root chaired the board, while Jordan Greenhalgh was a trustee, and they were contemplating the future of civilization. Like I said, Peter Thiel, a figure that we all know now about because of Palantir, but let's not forget that Peter Thiel comes from Frankfurt, and then we go back to one of the base hotspots of the Sabbatean Frankist heresy, because that's where it sprang out. And it wasn't only involving Jews, because Peter Thiel is not a Jew, but it was also involving Christians who went into their lodges. The Asiatic Brethren was extremely influential in this whole thing. It was extremely influential because it was the first Masonic organization that welcomed Jews into their lodges. Jews were not welcome in any Masonic obedience in Europe, especially in Germany, and they were definitely not welcome even in the Illuminati of Adam Weishaupt. That is a specific rule that tells you not to get the Jews to join. I know it sounds a little bit controversial, this whole thing, but in the end, when you understand how they were operating, they compartmentalize with this Asiatic Brethren the creation of something that then was extremely influential. I mean, the Asiatic Brethren became the influential order for the Ordo Templi Orientis that then, of course, welcome Aleister Crowley. The teachings of Aleister Crowley, the teachings of Madame Blavatsky. I mean, here we're talking about the very teachings that are considered so influential today in so-called sexual magic, and everybody's always talking about these things and think that Crowley is the God that created all. No, he was simply a guy who took teachings that were already elaborated before him. He formulated them with his philosophy of telema. But in reality, when we see the foundation documents of the OTO, we see a direct reference to the Asiatic Brethren, also known as the Frater Lucis, because they were also connected to the Frater Lucis. So they became, when the Sabbatean Frankists entered the Masonic Illuminati network in Europe at the time, they became extremely influential. If today, if in the century that followed, we had the Golden Dawn, we had then all these orders that were doing their own thing with Kabbalah and stuff, is because they were inspired by the Sabbatean Frankists. How does this whole thing evolve? It evolves from a guy called Hecker Unenkoffen, Hans Erich von Hecker Unenkoffen, who was a German nobleman, a Bavarian officer, who gave birth initially to a group called the Order of the Wheel and the Order of the Rosy Cross. He was actually a member of the Order of the Golden Rosy Cross, which, by the way, I also explain in Volume 12 of my Confession, is a Jesuit creation of the time. He was then kicked out of it. He founded this briefly lived Ordo Rotet Aure Crucis, which though became extremely influential in 1776 because it inspired then the birth of Adam Weishaupt's Illuminati. The success of his order, of this Rosicrucian thing, didn't really work out for him, But it worked out when he went to Munich, and we said Munich is a Sabatier and Frankist place is another, let's say, aside from Frankfurt, Munich and Vienna are very important for the Sabatier and Frankists. And it was there that certain Sabatier and Frankists were introduced to him. And then at that point, he opened his lodges to all the Jews, but these were no ordinary Jews. He was opening the lodges to the Sabbatean Frankist Jews. So the main people behind him at that point was actually a direct relative of Jacob Frank, who had, now Moses Dobruska is a very important figure because it also demonstrates there is a direct link with the French Revolution here. Like there is a direct link, we said earlier, with the rise of Nazism. Here we have a direct link with the philosophie sociale and with the very birth of one of the most important moments in the history of the Western world, because the French Revolution is considered such. Now, he was known as Moses Dobruska. He was the son of the first cousin of Jacob Frank. He was the grandson of the guy who wrote this holy book of the Sabbateans, the rabbi that was involved in this controversy, because the Rabbi Eberschutz was attacked and became involved in one of the biggest controversies, the Hemden-Eberschutz controversy, which we don't have now time to go into, but is then described in my book, very important. The Knights. Now, when he became one of the main activists of these Knights of St. John the Evangelist for Asian Europe, commonly referred as the Asiatic Brethren, he, of course, filtered the teachings that he had received from the Sabbatean world, the Sabbatean Frankist world. I mean, a guy so close to Jacob Frank was, of course, influenced by his teaching and was filtering in the lodge. But he wasn't the only one. Together with him, there was another Sabbatean Frankist called Ephraim Joseph Ingerschelt, who had been a German Jewish mystic, very much involved in the Jewish Enlightenment, because he was then very close with Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn is considered one of the most important figure in the development of the Ashkalah, which is the Jewish Enlightenment. Here we are talking about the modernization of Judaism. It's like the Sabbatean Frankists, thanks to these figures, pushed certain Jews to secularize themselves and distance themselves from their religion more and more. So if they couldn't get them to become heretics, they will get them to become atheists. Like you said earlier, there is a similarity here with Satanism, and because in the end, even if of course Satanism can be, also considered something that is born within the Jewish milieu, Jewish faith, let's say, it's with Christianity that we usually refer to the Satanic Mass as the reversal of everything Catholic and Christian. They were reversing everything that was Jewish. Yeah. The formulas, the way of... So while in the lodges of Freemasonry, they focused in bringing this fusion of Judaism, Christianity, Kabbalistic nonsense all together with this, of course, Frankist point of view, then this became the basic elements of that sexual magic that eventually will be then practiced by Aleister Crowley. So here we're talking about a direct formal link. The lodges of the Asiatic Brethren didn't disappear after the death of Jacob Frank or after Moses Dobruska was put on the guillotine, because he then became known as Junius Frey. He went with the Jacobins to fight in the French Revolution, and he will eventually lose his head, which is kind of, but in the meantime, he became extremely influential. He still maintain, of course, contact, like also with the others who were involved still in the Asiatic Brethren, like Ephraim Joseph Hirschfeld, who was more connected with the Offenbach court. The Offenbach court was the court because Jacob Franco, when he was liberated by the Russians, he went to Offenbach, he took this castle, and he became the Baron. He became all these Sabatian Frankists at that point had become nobles. Even Schoenfield himself, Moses Dobruska was a noble, was an aristocrat. That was their aim, was to become integrated with the aristocracy, with the noble families of Europe, initially within the Catholic world, then the black aristocracy close to the Vatican, then with the Anglican aristocracy and of the Church of England. The Rothschilds were nobilitated in England. So in the end, this nobilitation makes them very different from your ordinary Jew. And when Theodor Herzl eventually came with the idea of the Zionist movement, and then they had to put together, though, at that point, there was a very fractured Jewish world. There was a Jewish world that was talking Yiddish in the Ashkenazi community and being Orthodox and kind of defined as primitive and tribal by the secularized Jews, who would say, these people, they are like, a little bit tribal, a bit like Franz Kafka himself, a Jew, a secularized Jew, let's say a figure very close to, let's say, the ideas that were promoted by the more secularized Jewish Enlightenment approach. But at the same time, we have to understand that all this splitting Judaism in various currents, and then the arrival of Zionism, the arrival of different kinds of Zionism, because, you create the left Zionist, labor Zionist, you create the right Zionist, revisionist Zionist, create in the Hegelian tactics of creating the opposites. Ultimately, we see that the Sabbatean Frankists were the ones who inspired the very formation of the State of Israel, which was defined by my late friend Barry Kamish as a Sabbatean state. So I think that in my book, finally, you have all this, and it's not an anti-Semitic book, because, in fact, I have Jewish people, even from the Hasidic community, who are reading this book, who are complimenting me for the respect I have of Judaism. Because, you see, it's very easy to fall into the anti-Semitic nonsense, to the typical bashing of the Jews. You can never do that with an entire race. It's ignorance. You can condemn an ideology. You can condemn a sectarian reality.
Seems to be part of our modern Hegelian dialectic to further divide people and bring them further away from what's really happening. I want to get your thoughts on what is unfolding now, where we're at with the Epstein trial. What is this administration's role in everything? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, forced into maybe redacting a lot of stuff that will then be made public, but we will never have the videos of Ehud Barak raping Virginia Giuffre or other monstrosities. You can forget that. I mean, we're going to have a highly filtered version of things, because the people who are behind the Sabbatean Frankists, as I demonstrate in my book, and they are people who most of the time you never heard of, but they have control of the banking system, of the automobile industry, of other important elements, the military industrial complex, as well as the big pharma. Those people, they don't want the truth, the entire truth behind Jeffrey Epstein to ever be known. The fact that after Lex Wexner, then you have Robert Maxwell, the father of Ghislaine, into the equation. He himself died in a mysterious way. In the same way that we have a Jeffrey Epstein who is suicided, we have a Robert Maxwell who is suicided. Let's not forget that. These people are often kept alive until they are no longer, reputed safe, and then they are eliminated.
So much of what you've written about over the years seems to be unfolding as we speak. You mentioned the Dark Enlightenment, the transhuman movement, this technocracy that is taking over everything. It seems like we're moving closer and closer to an AI governance system, which is terrifying. Do you have hope? What are your thoughts on where we're at with all that?
Well, as you know, I had written, in fact, a trilogy dedicated to Cyber Satan, volume 6.66, which we discussed in the past, then volume 7 and volume 9, Cyber Satan as the ultimate evil development of the AI world, artificial intelligence and robotics, who, by the way, like we said, they were central also to, like people will discover reading my book, to the work of Jeffrey Epstein, are to be used for the control of people who are going to be highly discontent, who will feel betrayed more and more by the political establishment, who will no longer go and vote, who might even think about civil unrest, but by that point, the technology in front of us, robotics and AI, will make it impossible for them to really go totally off the grid or escape from what is already a prison planet with thousands of satellites around it. And this is really unfortunate, but it's the reality we have to face. We cannot be illuding ourselves like some people in the New Age community or in the truther movement in the past saying, oh, the moment of reckoning is coming, we are getting freed. Guys, getting freed means, at that point, if we really have to be absolutely honest about it, giving up your bank account, giving up everything that you have material, because they own it, not you. They are the ones who have produced it, they are the ones who have sold it to you, and they're the ones who are going to continue to strive over this materialistic realm, unfortunately. We can hope maybe for a number of years to be creating maybe an independent off-the-grid reality that doesn't accept the compromises of the AI. But that will mean at least 1 million people that come together and say, okay, we buy this island, or we go and overtake Little St. James and Big St. whatever island is next to it that actually Epstein had bought also another island, by the way, it's never talked about, a bigger island next to it. And so at that point, we could maybe have a degree of independence. But I'm being realistic here. This planet nowadays has been compromised because that technology, that reverse engineering, if you think about it, comes from the very fallen angels that we have been always trying to fight and to expose.
For the longest time, I've had an understanding that there is no savior coming. There's no heroes at any high level in power, that we're basically on our own when it comes to this stuff. Would you agree with that? Or do you think there is someone in power that may be working against some of these things?
There is people in every institution in the world. There is honest people, good people who don't like what is happening, who don't like where we are heading. But unfortunately, they are a minority. Unfortunately, the moment you are in those institutions, you are meant to compromise. The moment you go to the White House, you sit on that chair, you are compromising, because there is no way that you can say no to the big pharma, the military industrial complex, the banking cartel, the whole system once you are there. And that also what is really becoming more and more evident with the second Trump presidency. So I think that disappointment in politics can only lead to abandoning politics altogether in search maybe of an alternative off-the-grid solution, at least to create a microcosm that doesn't bring us under the complete control and domination of that AI, which is inevitably being used already now to control our minds. Technocracy is our enemy, is not our friend. And whoever claims the contrary, because, we have those who claim, yeah, but there is a positive way we can use this, a positive way. It's like playing with fire. And it's like saying that, using a nuclear facility in Japan is a positive thing when we all know that Japan is prone to earthquakes, and in fact we saw it with Fukushima, a complete disaster, and nobody's talking about it. But for 1,000 years more, we were going to have radioactivity from that terrible event that happened. So we have to be honest also. And the problem here, I see a lot of finger pointing, a lot of exposure work. But in the sense, when it comes to the UFO thing, it's also part of the problem. And it's going to be more and more part of the problem. The more they actually come out and reveal us more about it, their so-called exposure, it's all part of something that is coming. And you were saying, is there a savior? Well, if we have to be honest, within all the religions in the world, there is a figure that might oppose this derangement. At the same time, we have also the rise of a figure that is commonly referred to as the Antichrist, that will endorse it. So I have still hope that maybe we can somehow oppose this. And that is my hope. I mean, I'm not, I'm simply stating that the prophets of old, including Jesus and the Christian world, have always promised us that this moment will come. So we should, of course, be ready for it. Yeah. But to compromise like today's Christians do often, or other religions, thinking that they have the only way and that they are the answers to all the problems, and that eventually it's not an easy thing when you know very well that God is definitely the answer to things, and can be, of course, a great moment for us to maybe deal directly without all these organized religions who seem to inevitably be corrupt at one point or the other.
I agree. The teachings of Jesus Christ are the easiest way to navigate your way through the madness. So if there's anything that can be recommended, I'd probably go there.
Absolutely. But in fact, the fact that we have so much instrumental use of Jesus still to this day by the very people who claim to be Christians or Catholics or this or that, it demonstrates that the demonic forces, what we commonly refer to as the devil or Satan, has all the interest to control those teachings in some way. Now, when it comes to the Jewish world, they didn't have an acceptance of Jesus, and for that reason, they were prone to fall for these false messiahs, and that is where Shabbatai Zevi comes in, Jacob Frank, and even Baruch Russo, these people who have inevitably brought Judaism in the wrong direction. If they accepted Jesus 2,000 years ago, this would have never happened.
Yeah.
That gives you also a very clear indication. But it's also true that Jesus himself became the matter of political and geopolitical interest. With the Council of Nicaea onwards, we start seeing compromises upon compromises. It becomes a state religion for the Roman Empire, and at that point you have the Vatican, which I find the most anti-Christian institution today you can see in the world.
100%. Well, one thing we can do is learn as much as we can, and you have many books out there that have been predicting everything.
I mean, I would suggest, for what we discussed today, I would suggest, of course, The Rise and Fall of a Frankist Monster, exposing Jeffrey Epstein and the most powerful Jewish sect in the world. But also, before that, this is the last installment of my confessions. I'm no longer doing any other confessions, because my intention was to describe in 12 books this whole pyramid of power. And you arrive to the top of the pyramid, where we commonly refer to the all-seeing eye, which in reality is the Jesuit general, is the Jesuits, is the power that controls also the secret societies we commonly refer to as Illuminati or Freemasonry. And this, I think, is very important. There is also another book which we have never discussed, me and you, which I suggest for our readers, which is about Islamic Freemasonry and the secret societies behind the eternal conflict in the Middle East, because it received praises even from the Islamic world, even from the Sufis, which I criticize in the book, because they say it's evident that I have respected, I've respected the religion in a way that I claim sources which are credible. I don't simply speculate in my books. So that is definitely something that I suggest for all our viewers to read into my books, because when you have maybe 90 minutes, 60 minutes, an interview, it's simply scratching the surface of something that requires further studies. And also today, with this culture of scrolling on the web through your phone and thinking that you can get all the truth with a page or two on the internet, it's completely wrong. You need to really go much deeper if you want to have a complete awareness. And then at that point, once you are aware of all these things, create your own reality and promote it with your friends and people who are like-minded, to create maybe at least a microcosm of people who have a reason in this world of increased madness and chaos.
Excellent. I agree 100%. Leo, thank you so much. We'll definitely be doing this again. So much more we can discuss. And until next time, everyone, have an excellent evening. We will talk again tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Hello, friends. I am so excited to tell you about Independent Media Token. Independent Media Token is a brand new way to show your support for independent media without having to donate a dime. Independent Media Token is a cryptocurrency on the Solana blockchain designed to generate funds to promote and foster the growth of independent content creators, allowing them to engage in their art without having to worry about being demonetized. Through a network of media partners, of which you yourself can become a part of, Independent Media Token's goal is to ensure the powers that be can never cut off all of our areas of funding and censor the only free voices left in the world. Join the movement today. You can pick up Independent Media Token using Phantom Wallet or the Solana wallet of your choice, where you can easily swap your Solana for IMT. Grab some IMT today and remember to always know your team. To learn more, visit independentmediatoken.com or use the link right in the description. Are you and your family prepared for an emergency? Maybe the fake alien invasion? Now is the time to prepare yourself and your family for any event. Check out Prep Starts Now. Their mission is to provide high-quality preparedness products that empower individuals and families to be ready for any situation. They're committed to delivering reliable, trusted gear to ensure your safety, security, and peace of mind in times of need. Their product selection is carefully curated to provide you with the essential gear you need to stay prepared. From emergency kits to tactical tools, every item is chosen for its reliability and practicality. Prep Starts Now understands the importance of family, and their goal is to equip you with everything you need to build a solid plan for your family's preparedness. In today's ever-changing world, being prepared is more important than ever, and Prep Starts Now is here to help you and your family stay ready with quality products and practical guidance. Use the link in the description and get 15% off your order. If you're looking to start your therapeutic microdosing journey, but don't know where to start, especially when looking for the highest quality ingredients, including nootropics, and what you'd expect from a true microdose capsule, check out our friends at Brainsupreme. They offer the absolute highest quality ingredients so you can start your microdosing journey knowing that you're getting top-notch ingredients. To find out more, visit their website using that link right in the description, and you can get 15% off your entire order.